After growing up in an orphanage, he was left all alone. But one morning in the old house changed his life forever. Main characters: Ethan Sanders, former orphan; Mrs. Henderson, orphanage director; Jacob, fellow orphan; Allison, bank teller. Ethan Sanders shut his suitcase one last time, feeling a surge of finality ripple through the small room that had been his entire world. At 18 years old, he was about to leave Mapleview Orphanage in Denver, Colorado, a place that had been simultaneously his home and the embodiment of his loneliness. Mrs. Henderson, the orphanage director, stood by the doorway, gazing at Ethan with a mixture of pride and concern. She was in her late 50s, tall and composed, with warm brown eyes and hair that had turned silver at the temples. Since the day Ethan was dropped off at Mapleview as a baby, Mrs. Henderson had acted as something of a parent to him. She had tended to his scraped knees, read him bedtime stories, and counseled him whenever the hopelessness of not having a traditional family weighed too heavily on his heart. "Ethan," Mrs. Henderson began softly, I've been trying to find the right words to tell you. I'm proud of the young man you've become. You've got talent and kindness in spades. Wherever life takes you, know that we at Mapleview are always here for you." He set the suitcase on the scuffed hardwood floor and nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Thanks, Mrs. Henderson. I honestly don't know how I'm going to do this on my own." A faint smile tugged at her lips. "You're more ready than you think." There was a knock on the partially open door. Jacob, an orphan a couple of years younger than Ethan, poked his head through. His wide grin showed braces, and he fidgeted like someone who had run 3 blocks in a hurry. "Hey, Ethan," Jacob said with forced cheer. "You really leaving? I can't believe it." Ethan stuffed a gray hoodie into his suitcase. "Believe it, bud. Today's the day they say I'm an adult and can make it on my own. Crazy, right?" Jacob's voice cracked slightly. "Well, before you go, can I give you something?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Sure." Jacob slid his hand into his jeans pocket and pulled out a small photograph. It showed Ethan and Jacob from a few years back, sitting on a bench under the orphanage's old oak tree, both grinning like they had just heard the best joke in the world. "This was taken after the time you taught me how to throw a football," Jacob explained, looking at the photo as if it were a priceless artifact. "I kept it 'cause you're like a big brother to me. Thought you might want to keep it now that you're leaving." Ethan felt emotion knot in his chest. "Jake, thanks, man. This means the world." They exchanged a quick hug, awkward but genuine. Then the time came for Ethan to walk out. His entire life fit in a suitcase and a backpack, and he had no guarantee about where he would end up tomorrow or next week. As he made his way to the orphanage's entrance, the older kids and some staff members stood in the hallway to bid him farewell. Everyone was gathered near the big oak doors. Mrs. Henderson was at the front, her expression trembling on the edge of tears. Outside, the autumn air was crisp, and leaves skittered across the worn pavement. Ethan turned around, noticing the red brick building of Mapleview one last time. He promised himself he'd come back to visit one day, when he had more stability. Maybe he'd even donate a little money, if he ever managed to find work that paid well. Unknown to him, life had a plan far more dramatic in store. As Ethan walked down the orphanage's front path, he heard Mrs. Henderson call out in a wavering voice, "Stay safe, Ethan, and call us if you need anything. Remember, you're never truly alone." He could hear the sorrow in her tone. Ethan looked back and forced a brave smile. "I promise, Mrs. Henderson. I'll be okay." He didn't know if that was a truth or simply a hope, but either way, it was enough for now. The road awaited him, along with the 1,000 uncertainties that came with it. By evening, Ethan felt the weight of the day pressing on him. He'd used a few of his meager savings to buy a bus ticket from the orphanage's suburban neighborhood into central Denver, where he spent hours looking for possible job openings. Prospects were slim. A few coffee shops had pinned "Help Wanted" signs in their windows, but they were also flooded with applicants. He scheduled one interview for a part-time position in a local bakery, but even that was a long shot. When night started closing in, Ethan realized he had nowhere to sleep. He had tried calling a state shelter, but it was already full. The possibility of booking even the cheapest motel room was impossible on his limited funds. With only a few dollars left to his name, the city streets grew colder and more foreboding than he'd ever imagined. He drifted further from downtown, eventually stumbling into a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts. Boarded-up houses lined the streets like ghosts of better times. Broken windows, graffiti-splashed walls, and overgrown lawns told the story of economic hardship. He felt uneasy, but desperation trumped his caution. Clouds gathered overhead, hinting at a cold rain that could come any moment. Clutching his backpack tightly, Ethan roamed until he spotted one particular house with a rusted chain-link fence surrounding it. The front door hung slightly off its hinges, and the windows were dark and lifeless. No sign of squatters or trouble, at least from the outside. The place looked miserable, but it was better than spending the night on the street. Ethan forced the door open with a gentle push. The hinges screeched, stirring dust motes in the faint moonlight filtering through a broken window. Inside, the air was thick with neglect, a stale odor of old newspapers and rotting wood, bits of debris crunched under his sneakers. But a single open room near the front had a large patch of floor that seemed relatively clear of shards or nails. He set his backpack down carefully, half expecting someone to leap from the shadows. When no one came, and only silence greeted him, he felt a slight sense of relief. He looked around for a moment. Dark corners, draped cobwebs, random boards strewn about, and finally convinced himself that the place was empty. "Guess this is home for tonight," he whispered to himself. He rummaged in his bag for the old hoodie Jacob had seen him pack that morning and fashioned it into a makeshift pillow. He lay on the creaky floor, which was half covered by peeling linoleum, and tried not to focus on the eerie stillness. Sleep was elusive, as the wind rattled the broken windows, and every distant creak felt like footsteps. Then exhaustion took over. After the longest hour of his life, Ethan drifted into a dreamless sleep, lulled by the pure weariness of a day that had been as emotionally draining as it was physically tiring. The rising sun filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, illuminating swirls of dust in the air. Ethan stirred awake, rubbing his eyes, momentarily confused about where he was. It took a few seconds to remember the events of the previous day. Leaving Mapleview, wandering the city, and stumbling into this abandoned house. He stretched on the floor, groaning at the stiffness in his muscles, then froze when he noticed something lying near his makeshift pillow. It was an envelope, white, sealed, and appearing brand new, oddly pristine against the dusty floor. His heart started pounding. Had someone come into the house during the night? Why would they leave an envelope? He picked it up slowly and held it, as if it might vanish or explode. There was no name scrawled on the front, no address. Carefully, he tore it open, revealing a folded note and a plastic card. The note read, "These funds are for you. Use them wisely. The password for the card is 1067. You deserve a chance in life because you are a good person." Ethan blinked in confusion. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, but there was no signature, and the plastic card was a bank debit card, emblazoned with the name E. Sanders. The shock nearly knocked the breath out of him. "What in the world?" he murmured out loud. He thumbed the card in disbelief. The note's words ran through his mind repeatedly. "These funds are for you. You deserve a chance, because you are a good person." None of it made sense. Standing up, he quickly shoved his few belongings into his backpack, then held the card up to the dingy light. E. Sanders was printed in standard black letters. That alone was suspicious. Someone had to have known he'd be there. But how could anyone anticipate that? Ethan's pulse raced. He needed to know if the card was legitimate. He needed to confirm if this was some elaborate scam. He stepped out of the abandoned house, glancing around in broad daylight. The neighborhood looked lifeless, but not quite as menacing as the night before. His nerves on fire, he started walking in the direction of the nearest convenience store, hoping to find an ATM or, at the very least, a place that sold prepaid phones so he could call the bank's customer service line. At a corner market with sun-bleached posters advertising cheap sodas, Ethan spotted a dusty ATM near the back by the restrooms. With trembling hands, he inserted the mysterious card. The machine asked for a PIN, and he typed 1067. A small beep followed, and the screen prompted him to choose a transaction type. He pressed check balance, half expecting an error message or an insulting zero. The machine hummed for a moment, its digital display blinking. And then a number appeared that made Ethan's heart hammer so hard he thought he might faint. 1,000 chacons. He couldn't believe his eyes. Could this be some bizarre glitch? Could $1 million have been placed on a card in his name? Had he walked into some trap? He canceled the transaction, removing the card, and stared at it like it was an otherworldly artifact. $1 million. 1,000 thoughts swarmed in his head. Confusion, elation, suspicion, fear. He let out an uncontrollable laugh, right there next to the automated teller. The only person who noticed was an old woman buying a pack of gum. She gave Ethan a strange look and hurried out the door. Ethan stuffed the card in his pocket and hurried outside as well, the crisp morning air doing little to quell the swirl in his mind. Could someone from Mapleview have orchestrated this? It seemed impossible. Mapleview didn't have that kind of money to spare, and if they did, they'd be using it to fix the orphanage's leaky roof, among other pressing needs. Could it be a hoax, a crime, or an attempt to set him up for something illegal? He had no clues. The note only said it was meant for him because he was a good person. No other explanation. But who would do that? He muttered under his breath, pacing along the cracked sidewalk. God? The thought flashed through his mind. He was not particularly devout, but he remembered how Mrs. Henderson would often say, "God works in mysterious ways." Now he was beginning to think she had a point. For the next hour, Ethan walked around in a daze. He found a quiet bench outside a decrepit pawn shop, sat down, and tried to gather his thoughts. The card was real. The ATM had confirmed it. He had $1 million to his name, assuming the bank didn't freeze it or claim there was a mistake. The orphan in him, who had grown up pinching pennies and wearing hand-me-down clothes, found this development impossibly surreal. Then a wave of guilt hit him. The orphanage. So many times he'd seen the staff struggle, families adopting fewer and fewer kids, leaving Mapleview with limited funds, the place that had raised him and others. Would it be right to keep all of this money for himself? Uncertain though he was, the next step felt obvious. Verify the legitimacy of the funds beyond an ATM. If it was real, he needed to figure out how to protect it, use it responsibly, and, most importantly, help Mapleview. Everything was about to change, and a sense of destiny began to solidify inside him. Ethan decided to approach a local branch of the bank printed on the debit card. He walked there, checking street signs to stay on track. His pulse raced as he stepped into the sterile, air-conditioned lobby. A row of tellers stood behind a large counter, and he joined the short line, feeling more out of place than ever. He was still wearing the rumpled jeans from the day before and a t-shirt that needed a good wash. When he got to the front, a teller named Allison smiled mechanically. "Hello. How can I help you today?" He said, pulling the card from his pocket. "I have this debit card, but I need to confirm the funds. It was given to me. I just want to be sure everything is valid and possibly set up an account." Allison typed a few keystrokes on her computer. "Certainly. Do you have an ID on you?" Ethan hesitated. He had a state ID from the orphanage program. He handed it over, worried it wouldn't match the name on the card or something equally bizarre. But the teller nodded like it was perfectly normal. "A checking account. I see a recent deposit," she said softly, eyes widening a fraction. "It's a deposit of $1 million?" Ethan swallowed, as though his throat had become sandpaper. "So it's real? It's in my name?" Allison nodded, a hint of shock escaping her professional demeanor. "Yes, sir. As of right now, you have a checking account that was opened a few days ago, and the deposit was cleared. It's all in your name, Ethan Sanders. Looks official." Suddenly, she eyed him carefully, probably noticing his casual clothing and the fact that he looked more like a homeless teenager than someone with a 7-figure bank account. "Would you like to speak to a financial advisor about your options?" she asked, her tone more respectful now. Ethan considered it. I might. But can I withdraw some cash first? And is it possible to arrange a bank transfer if I want to send money somewhere else?" "Of course," Allison replied, businesslike. "How much would you like to withdraw today?" He paused, half bewildered that she was even asking. "I don't know, 1,000 maybe? And I might also want to do a transfer of 500,000 to an institution if that's allowed." She raised her eyebrows but stayed professional. "We can help you do a direct wire transfer if you have the receiving bank's details, or a cashier's check if that's easier." He realized he didn't exactly have Mapleview's bank account number on hand, but he could get it. "I'll come back with the details," he said, pocketing the $1,000 in crisp bills after the withdrawal. "Thank you." Allison nodded, a slight curiosity still sparkling in her eyes. "Have a good day, Mr. Sanders." Ethan left the bank and let out the breath he'd been holding. It was all real. He had half a mind to run back to the abandoned house and see if there were more clues, but something told him it would be fruitless. If someone had wanted to be known, they would have left a name. Instead, all he could do was assume that a higher power or a mysterious benefactor had singled him out. His first instinct was to call Mapleview. He found a payphone outside a gas station. Paying for a cell phone could wait a few hours more, and dialed the number he knew by heart. The phone rang a few times before Mrs. Henderson's familiar voice answered. "Mapleview Orphanage, this is Mrs. Henderson speaking." Ethan swallowed. Hey, Mrs. Henderson. It's me, Ethan. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." He could almost hear her smile through the receiver. "Oh, Ethan. I'm so glad you called. How are you doing out there?" I'm good," he answered, choosing not to reveal his previous night's struggles. "Listen, I was wondering if you could give me the orphanage's bank information. I want to make a donation." She hesitated. A donation? Ethan, you just left here yesterday. Are you sure you're okay? You don't have a job yet, do you? Ethan squeezed the phone. I'm fine, Mrs. Henderson. It's complicated. But I came into some money. Don't ask me how just yet, because I don't fully understand it either. But I want to give back to Mapleview. He heard the director sigh softly. All right, dear. If this is important to you, I can have our finance officer email you or call you with the details. But do you even have an email address set up? Ethan realized that was still something he needed to do. I'll, create one. Or I can call them. Just give me the number, and we'll figure out how to do this properly. She read out a phone number for the small bank Mapleview used, then asked, Ethan, are you sure you're not getting scammed? You know I worry. He let out a slight chuckle. I do too, but I promise I'm taking precautions. I'll keep you posted. Please trust me. There was a pause on the line, then Mrs. Henderson's warm voice. I trust you, Ethan. You've always been a sensible boy. If you need guidance, I'm here. He thanked her and hung up. Just before the call ended, she reminded him once again how proud she was and how he would always have a place at Mapleview. For a moment, tears prickled in his eyes. The next few days were a whirlwind. Ethan found a cheap motel room where he finally got to sleep in a real bed. He replaced his threadbare clothes with a few sturdy outfits that didn't break the bank. He set up an appointment with the orphanage's finance officer to coordinate a large donation, $500,000. The figure stunned them. They tried to talk him down, but Ethan insisted. The memory of daily life at Mapleview, the struggles, the lack of resources, all made it clear that if he had stumbled into a fortune, half of it should go to the place that had given him so much. Ethan, this is unbelievably generous, Mrs. Henderson said over the phone. We can renovate the entire facility, maybe even add new programs or scholarship funds. I'm happy to help, Ethan responded. Mapleview was my family for 18 years. You deserve this. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The bank insisted on background checks, wanting to ensure the money wasn't laundered. Ethan found himself under scrutiny. He had to sign forms, answer questions about the sudden deposit. He truthfully had no explanation other than finding a card and a note. This story alarmed the bank's legal department, but the deposit had come through standard electronic channels, apparently from a legitimate, though anonymous, source. In the end, they had no grounds to freeze the funds. By the time the $500,000 transfer was complete, local rumors ran wild. Mapleview Orphanage had received the largest donation in its history. Reporters made inquiries. People who had never bothered with Ethan before suddenly wanted interviews. He felt overwhelmed and anxious that someone might try to manipulate him or claim the money was stolen. One day, while sorting through an avalanche of calls, he got a phone call from a private number. A gruff male voice came on the line. Ethan Sanders? Yes, Ethan responded, heart jolting. You're that orphan who just gave $500,000 to Mapleview, right? Listen, are you sure you want this attention? People will come after you. Who is this? Ethan demanded. Someone who cares. Keep your head down. People don't just find money in random envelopes without consequences. The line clicked dead. Ethan's hands shook as he hung up. The intrigue around his unexpected fortune only deepened. But he pressed on, determined not to let fear overshadow the gratitude he felt. A few weeks later, Mapleview Orphanage underwent a visible transformation. The ancient roof was repaired, windows replaced, and long-needed expansions begun. The children had new supplies and improved facilities, courtesy of the largest donation in the orphanage's history. Local news outlets covered the story. Ethan tried to keep a low profile, but inevitably, a young donor with that level of generosity drew curiosity. Soon, Ethan moved into a modest apartment in a safer area of Denver. He furnished it with functional, not lavish pieces. Expensive living had never been his style, and the last thing he wanted was to squander his fortune. He still had $500,000 in his bank account, enough to support him comfortably for many years, maybe even a lifetime if he were careful. He also had a growing sense of responsibility, a desire to invest in his future wisely. One afternoon, as he sat in the living room of his new apartment, the doorbell rang. Expecting a grocery delivery, Ethan opened the door, only to find Jacob from Mapleview standing there with Mrs. Henderson. They wore beaming smiles. "Mind if we come in?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "Oh, not at all." Ethan stepped aside, excitement flickering in his chest. They took in the plain yet cozy apartment. Pale walls, a second-hand couch, and a small TV. Jacob's eyes darted around with curiosity. Henderson set down a small hamper filled with homemade cookies and essentials like tea bags, sugar, and a fresh loaf of bread. "A housewarming gift," she explained, patting Ethan's shoulder gently. "You didn't have to," he said, feeling warmth spread through him. "But thank you." Jacob flopped onto the couch, glancing at Ethan with a grin. "So you're like a millionaire, right?" Ethan rolled his eyes, more amused than annoyed. He's half a millionaire technically, and that's not the point. Jacob shrugged. "Still big money. Why can't we do something fun like get a huge TV or—" "Jacob," Mrs. Henderson said in a gentle reprimand. She turned to Ethan. "I'm proud of how you've handled this situation. And the donation you made, it's changing so many lives. It's just such a miracle." Ethan pressed his lips together. "Honestly, I still can't wrap my head around it. There's no clue about who left that envelope. No one stepped forward." Mrs. Henderson nodded. "Sometimes we'll never know. But remember what I used to say, that maybe God looks out for us in ways we don't expect." A thoughtful silence filled the room. Jacob eventually changed the subject, asking if Ethan had considered going to college or a trade school. The question sparked a conversation about the possibilities that lay ahead. For the first time in his life, Ethan didn't have to say he couldn't afford it. "I don't want to stay idle," Ethan said. "I'm thinking about applying to a local community college. Maybe take courses in business administration or social work. Something that'll let me help people in the long run." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Mrs. Henderson responded brightly. "And if you ever need a reference, you know I'll give you my highest recommendation." They stayed for a while, nibbling on cookies, sharing updates on the orphanage's renovations, and planning for the future. Jacob teased Ethan about how he'd break hearts now that he had money. Ethan scoffed, but he felt relief that the tension of secrecy and confusion was balanced by genuine companionship. Before they left, Mrs. Henderson took Ethan's hand in both of hers. "Ethan, you've done a marvelous thing by donating to Mapleview. But remember, you deserve to take care of yourself too. Don't feel guilty if you want to enjoy life. This is your blessing." He glanced away, his eyes stinging with tears he tried to suppress. "Thank you. I just hope I make the right decisions." With that, they said their goodbyes. When the door closed, the apartment felt both quiet and peaceful. Ethan sank onto the couch, replaying their conversation in his head. He thought of the old abandoned house where he'd first discovered the envelope, If he ever wanted proof that life could shift in an instant, that moment was it. He never found out who placed that envelope by his sleeping form that fateful night. Occasionally, he scoured the internet, searching for clues or unexplained charitable acts in Denver. He found nothing that pointed to his situation. Sometimes, deep in his gut, he believed it truly was God, or at least an angel, reaching out to him. Other times, he wondered if some eccentric philanthropist had chosen him at random. But the note's words, "because you are a good person," haunted him in a hopeful way. Months turned into years. Ethan enrolled in community college courses in nonprofit administration, determined to build a life that meant more than personal comfort. He stayed close to Mapleview, volunteering his time, mentoring the younger kids who had lost hope. The orphanage had blossomed with the infusion of funds. New staff had been hired. The building was modernized, and the children had access to resources Ethan never did when he was young. Word of Ethan's story spread quietly, and occasionally, strangers would approach him with curiosity or envy. He remained guarded, refusing to let anyone exploit him or his fortune. The threat of manipulative strangers, hinted at by the mysterious phone call, sometimes loomed in his thoughts. But as time passed without incident, that phone call took on the quality of a distant echo, something to remind him that not everyone would celebrate his good fortune. Despite the lingering questions, Ethan found a profound sense of purpose in his new life. He no longer felt like a victim of circumstance. He was no longer the orphan who had to wear second-hand clothing and wonder if he'd ever be chosen for adoption. Instead, he was a benefactor, a helper, and a signpost that sometimes blessings do occur, however inscrutable they might be. One late autumn evening, about 2 years after he had left Mapleview, Ethan sat on the porch of his modest condo, sipping a mug of hot cocoa. A gentle breeze carried the scent of falling leaves. His phone buzzed with a notification. A new message from Jacob, now a high school senior, telling him about a successful football game and how proud he was to see Mapleview's new sports field. Ethan's gaze lifted to the stars overhead. He remembered that night when he had no bed, no security, and no future. He remembered the fear that had kept him awake, the hopelessness creeping into his soul, and he remembered how everything changed the moment he woke up the next morning to find that envelope. He sighed, letting a grateful smile cross his lips. Softly, he murmured, "Thank you, whoever you are." He didn't expect a reply. The silent twinkle of distant stars was the only response, and that, in its own way, was perfectly enough.